and thank you very much for coming and joining me again. Okay, so this week I'm going to try something similar but very different. I can't see in my mind's eye yet what the end result is going to look like, so I'm just going to let it evolve. So I'm going to attempt to turn a cauldron, but a cauldron with a difference. I am going to try to fill it with some resin and use a project light inside it to illuminate the inside of the cauldron with the resin. Now if that is successful, I can take it one stage further and mount it on some kind of a base with a fire underneath it, with using some sticks and some resin also illuminated to create the effect of the fire. Now all that sounds quite ambitious, and it indeed is, but as I said, I'm just going to let it evolve and see what happens. So the first task then, to find a suitable piece of timber. Initially I looked at this old piece of cherry, but once I got it on the bandsaw I realised it was quite punky inside and not really suitable. So in the end I opted for a piece of cypress, although I initially was worried about the moisture content. It's showing 13–14%, which is acceptable for this project. So first task then is to get the log roughed out down to bare wood through the bark and see what we have to play with. Once I've got it roughed out, I can then just map out the shape of the cauldron, which is almost a sphere, I guess. As you can see, there's plenty of wood to play with here. I'm turning a tenon on the bottom to mount in the colossus jaws. Turning the task over to a spindle gouge, having forgotten at this stage, look, to actually dismount the piece and put it in the colossus jaws. I noticed that I hadn't moved the piece onto the colossus jaws when it came time to hollowing, of course. Starting off the process of hollowing here with one of my favourite tools, which is Simon Hope's 6mm mini hollower. It really didn't take any time at all to excavate this piece with the 6mm cutter, so I was soon able to switch tools over to the Sorby scraper to get a reasonable finish on the inside. Having achieved the necessary finish on the inside, I have to think about doing a bit of abrasive work now. Having parted off the cauldron, I can now move it across to the button jaws to finish off the base. I'll just round off the base using a bowl gouge and some abrasive work just to make it reasonably smooth. As I alluded to before, the cauldron is going to be lying on its side a bit because of a missing foot. So I'm going to mark out the position of 3 feet, but only actually make 2. So these 2 feet are simply going to be made from a piece of 10mm dowel, which I'm going to glue in using CA glue. Okay, time for an update. The project, as expected, is evolving rather than planned, and I'm pretty set now on having a cauldron with a broken leg sat in a fire pit. Now the cauldron will have green resin in it at an angle because the cauldron's going to be sitting on two legs, and it will be sitting in a fire pit of red resin. So the next step is to get some colour inside of the cauldron, some green, because to match the green resin, and think about what I'm going to do with the outside. Now, as far as the outside goes, I want it to look like cast iron, in fact rusty cast iron, so I think I'm going to give it some treatment with the Modern Masters Rust Effect reactive paints. What I'm doing here is looking at several different green colours that I've got, and I eventually settle on the chestnut green spirit stain. So I give the inside of the cauldron a liberal dousing in this spirit stain, also adding a little bit round the lip to simulate some spillage from the cauldron. Moving on to the outside, I'm going to use Modern Masters Metal Effect paint, which is a three-part process. Firstly, you need to apply this primer, which adds a barrier between the wood and the reactive paint. There are several ways you can apply this, but I opt to use a piece of sponge, which is in fact the easiest way for me to apply it. The second stage of the process is to add the oxidizing metal paint. Typically this will take 2 to 3 coats before you get good coverage of the piece. Now I have to comment on the odour that comes out of this particular pot. I must say it's quite disgusting. Nevertheless, I've used it several times before and I've always been pleased with the outcome. Now, while that's drying off, I can turn my attention to the base. I found in my wood pile this piece of sycamore slab, which I think will be almost ideal for the task. In particular, I see this bulbous part in the middle of the slab as being the most interesting piece of wood there. So having successfully removed the piece of wood from the slab on the bandsaw, the concept is that the cauldron will sit in a hole in the middle of this piece of wood. Now I'm going to be mounting this on a glue block to turn it on the lathe, and the first thing I want to do is to drill a hole down through the centre. The need for this hole will become apparent in due course. As already mentioned, I'm going to mount this piece on my Mike Walt inspired hex nut glue block. Now the hole in the centre serves two purposes. Firstly, it's to insert a stick between the glue block and the wood to make sure they line up when they glue them. And secondly, the hole will be used to insert the LED light, which will optimistically illuminate the resin. Now normally when I use a glue block, I advocate the use of a hot air gun to bring both surfaces of the wood up to temperature. But despite the fact that it's the third week of February, the temperature inside my workshop today is 27 degrees centigrade. So moving on to the hollowing of the base to make the recess where the cauldron will fit, I'm just going to use my Sorby 3/8 bowl gouge until I get the right profile. Now once I've achieved that, I decided to give the base a generous coat of melamine lacquer to avoid any bits of the bark or the moss or the lichen that's present there from being lost. So then the outside of the cauldron isn't bad. It's going to require a little more work towards the end, but that can wait. In the meantime, I've found some hazel twigs to make the simulated logs. The plan here is to tack the logs in place using a hot glue gun, pour in the coloured resin, and then turn out a recess to sit the cauldron in. Now, once I have the logs tacked into place, I have to turn to the resin. Now, the people that know me know I do not like working with resin. I seem unable to work with it without it getting stuck to everything in sight. As far as colouring it goes, I've decided to use a colour described as orangish red, simply because it's the only one I have. Now time to pour the resin into the recess. The hole which I drilled through has been blocked by the stick which I passed through the glue block. The trick here is not to overfill it and let the resin run down the side of the base. Once I've got the resin in the nooks and crannies and it looks okay, I'm just going to leave it overnight to cure. Okay, next morning then, mount it back on the lathe and just hollow out a recess to match the profile of the base of the cauldron. And there's another reason why I don't like turning resin. The horrible mess and the stringy resin shavings that get everywhere. I detest it. While I have the piece still mounted on the lathe, I'm going to drill a 10mm hole right through the base for the LED light to be fitted. Next task then is to remove the piece from the glue block and clean the base up. At this stage I'm just going to sand the base because I need to figure out how to get the cable from the mains adapter to the LED. Okay then, the cauldron appears to fit in the recess quite well. We'll need to find exactly where it's going to sit and then make it its permanent location. So here I'm just going to do a test fit for the LED light. More about the LED light for this project and the illuminator for my lathe in next week's video. Now time to mix up some resin for the cauldron. Inevitably I overestimate the amount of resin that's needed, but I consider it's better to have some left over than some not enough and risk having different hues of the colour. Optimistically, these little pots I have with leftover coloured resin in may one day come in useful for other projects. Who knows? Now, before I started to pour, you can see I masked off the top of the cauldron with some frog tape to protect it from my inevitable dribbling. Also, off camera, I made a little ladle to fit in the pot just to add effect. So, having got the cauldron in the right position and therefore the angle in the right position and the ladle in the right position, now just a question of leaving it overnight to cure. Now, I didn't want a perfect casting. I wanted some artifacts and some bubbles left in there, so I didn't put the resin in the pressure pot. Next step then is to drill the hole through the base and extend it in through the wall of the cauldron into the resin. Optimistically, the bulb will illuminate the resin in the base and the resin in the pot. Now, the green resin that appears in the drill swarf is a good indication that I've reached all the way through to the inside of the cauldron. And a quick test run here inserting the LED light shows that both the green and the red resin are effectively illuminated. So the final task then is to secure the cable to the LED light. Now, to achieve this, I can make use of this natural feature in the base. I can enlarge the feature in the base to accommodate the wire and cut a new channel between the end of this and the centre to accommodate the rest of the cable. I successfully achieved this with the aid of my Dremel with a spherical cutter. And finally I tacked the cable into place in the groove using some small amounts of epoxy resin in case I ever need to remove it. So the reveal then shows the principle works quite well. I think I'll do a bit more work on the lichen and on the bark to make it a bit more presentable, but apart from that I'm very pleased with the outcome of this project.